Greetings, students. My name is Mr. Washington, and in today's video, we're going to be discussing the different types of conflict that can be found in a work of fiction. Today's video is brought to you by the Hayfield Secondary School English 7 Collaborative Team. This video will be about 15 minutes long, and you should be taking notes along the way. But feel free to pause or stop as many times as you like if the video moves too fast. To begin with, all great stories must have conflict.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
Without conflict, the story really wouldn't be worth reading. With most stories, the whole purpose of reading the story is to see what problems the main character faces and to see how he or she solves those problems. No problems, no story. So today we're going to be taking notes. The topic of these notes is the types of conflict. You're going to need something to write with, and you're going to need a copy of the Cornell Notes on the types of fiction, which should look something like this. The first thing you'll want to do is write your topic and objective. That goes right at the top in the middle, just underneath the words topic and objective, and the topic, of course, is the types of conflict. You'll also want to write your name, class, and period and date in the upper right-hand corner, right about here. These notes should be stored in your binder and can be used to study for quizzes and tests and on any assignments that deal with the types of conflict. Our standard and objective, and you don't necessarily have to write this down, but it is important to be familiar with it. There are actually two objectives that we're going to be looking at as a part of this presentation. The first deals with external conflict, and our goal is to be able to recognize external conflict. Our other objective deals with internal conflict. We want to be able to recognize internal conflict, and we want to be able to tell the difference between the two. Now, your essential question is something you do need to write down. There's a spot for the essential question just beneath the topic and objective at the top of your notes. There are actually two essential questions that we'll be dealing with. The first essential question is, what is a conflict? The second essential question is a bit longer. That question says, what are the different types of conflict and how are they defined and explained? By the time we're done with these notes, we'll be able to answer both of these questions and we will have met our objective. So let's begin by defining a conflict. A conflict is a problem or a struggle in a story between the protagonist, who's the main character in the story, and an opposing force, which would usually be an antagonist, which is the force that works against the protagonist. There are two main types of conflict that we want to be familiar with. The first type of conflict is called an external conflict. An external conflict would look something like this. The other type of conflict that we want to be familiar with is called an internal conflict. An internal conflict would look something like this. Now that we've defined a conflict, let's take a closer look at internal and external conflicts and how they would look in a story. Let's take a closer look at external conflict. External conflict is defined as a conflict that takes place between a character and an outside force, and will probably look something like this, with a character engaged in some sort of problem with a force outside of himself or herself. There are 5 main external conflicts that we want to be familiar with. The first type of external conflict can be described as an individual versus individual conflict. The second type of external conflict is described as individual versus nature. The third is described as individual versus society. The fourth is described as individual versus the supernatural. And the fifth and final type of external conflict is described as individual versus technology. When we look at these 5 descriptions, notice what each of them has in common. They all begin with the word individual, which can sometimes be interchanged with other words such as character, as in character versus nature, etc. Notice also the word versus, abbreviated as VS. The word versus is important because it helps explain the two sides that are engaged in the conflict, usually the protagonist and the antagonist. When describing a conflict, it is a good idea to use the word or abbreviation for versus because it helps you clearly identify the two sides of the conflict. Now that we've given them all a name, let's take a look at some examples of external conflict in works of fiction in the world around us. So our first type of external conflict is called an individual versus individual conflict. This is a conflict that takes place between two or more characters. An example might be Harry Potter versus He Who Will Not Be Named in the Harry Potter series. And we've got a short clip that kind of shows you what an individual versus individual conflict might look like if we were watching it in a movie or TV show.
Harry! Oh, I'd almost forgotten you were here, standing on the bones of my father. I'd introduce you, but word has it you're almost as famous as me these days.
The boy who lived.
How lies have fed your legend, Harry. Shall I reveal what really happened that night 13 years ago? Shall I divulge how I truly lost my powers? It was love. You see, when dear sweet Lily Potter gave her life for her only son, she provided the ultimate protection. I could not touch him. It was old magic, something I should have foreseen. But no matter, no matter. Things have changed. I can touch you now. Astonishing what a few drops of your blood will do. Pick up your wand, Potter. I said pick it up. Get up, get up! You've been taught how to duel, I presume, yes? First, we bow to each other. Come on now, Harry, the niceties must be observed. Dumbledore wouldn't want you to forget your manners, would he? I said bow. That's better. And now... That a boy, Harry. Your parents would be proud. Especially your filthy muggle mother. I'm going to...
Now I see why we're not supposed to say his name. Individual versus individual conflict. Our next type of external conflict is called an individual versus nature conflict. This is defined as a conflict that takes place between a character and a force of nature. A force of nature can be anything from an animal to a storm to a natural disaster and can be found in all sorts of literature and movies and films. Our example comes from a movie from the year 2000 called Castaway, starring Tom Hanks. In Castaway, Tom Hanks' character Chuck is stranded on a desert island and has to struggle to stay alive for 4 years. Let's take a look at a clip of what it might be like to try and struggle against nature.
I got a gift for you.
Oh, my.
My granddaddy used it on the Southern Pacific.
I'm always going to keep this on Memphis time.
Merry Christmas.
I love you.
I love you too.
I'll be right back. Hey, is all this turbulence from Santa and those 8 tiny reindeer? Better buckle up, Chuck. It's gonna get bumpy. should have gotten on that plane.
They think that I am right here. 100 miles squared. That's a search area of 500,000 square miles. That's twice the size of Texas.
From the Academy Award-winning director of Forrest Gump,
We live and we die by time, don't we?
Tom Hanks,
You wouldn't have a match. Any chance, would you?
at the edge of the world,
I have made fire!
the end of a man's journey will become the beginning of his life.
I would rather take my chance out there on the ocean than to stay here and die.
You were launched for 4 years. We had a funeral, coffin.
What was in it?
Individual versus nature. Our third type of external conflict is an individual versus society conflict. This is defined as a conflict that happens between a character and the laws within a community or a society. An example might be the Rosa Parks story. In this case, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to obey an unjust law. As a result of that conflict, the laws surrounding segregation in the South would eventually change. This is an individual versus society conflict. Our fourth type of external conflict is individual versus the supernatural. This type of conflict is defined as a conflict that occurs between a character and a supernatural force, such as werewolves, vampires, and other types of things that don't exist in the natural world. An example might be from the horror movie Annabelle, in which a creepy doll terrorizes a married couple. Individual versus supernatural. Our fifth and final type of external conflict is the individual versus technology. This is defined as a conflict that occurs between a character and a machine or technological force. An example might be The Matrix, starring Keanu Reeves. In The Matrix, the main character Neo fights against the agents of the Matrix, which is everything from machines to computer programs to robots. There are many types of individual versus technology conflicts. Individual versus technology. Not all conflicts are external. There's another type of conflict called an internal conflict. An internal conflict is a conflict that happens within the mind of a character. If we were to see an internal conflict, it might look something like this. Unlike external conflicts, which have many different types, there is only one way of describing an internal conflict, and that is the individual versus self. Individual versus self conflicts can be very difficult to show because they're happening inside of the mind of a character, but TV shows and movies often find creative ways to show us what's going on inside a character's head. Our example comes from the Disney movie The Emperor's New Groove. One of the characters, Kronk, has to make a decision whether to save a character or to let him perish. And here's how his internal conflict looks on the screen.
You're not just gonna let him die like that, are you?
My shoulder angel.
Don't listen to that guy. He's trying to lead you down the path of righteousness. I'm gonna lead you down the path that rocks.
Oh, come off it.
You come off it.
You.
You Infinity.
Ah.
Listen up, big guy. I got 3 good reasons why you should just walk away. Number 1, Look at that guy. He's got that sissy stringy music thing.
We've been through this. It's a harp, and you know it.
All right. That's a harp. And that's a dress.
Robe.
Reason number 2. Look what I can do.
But what does that have to do with anything?
No. He's got a point.
Listen, you guys, you're sort of confusing me, so, be gone. Or, however I get rid of you guys.
That'll work.
That is an individual versus self conflict. All right, so we've looked at the different types of conflict, the different types of external conflict, and we've looked at an internal conflict and seen some examples. Now let's take a look at the summary section that comes at the bottom of your second page of notes. For your summary, what you want to do is summarize what you've learned about an internal and external conflict. In a sentence or two, write down what an internal conflict is and what an external conflict is. That concludes our lesson on the different types of conflict. I hope you've learned a lot and I hope you took good notes. Now as you read, see if you can identify some of the different conflicts your characters may be facing. Thanks for tuning in.